College Football 25 Road to Glory. What would happen if we took the #1 high school quarterback prospect and put them at Army for their freshman year? In this episode, we're going to find out as Zaccheus Randle, the son of Zach Meadows and half-brother of Jordan Akira Meadows, decided to follow in his father's footsteps and go to Army as a run-first quarterback. Zaccheus and the Army would start off with a bit of a cupcake game against the Division II FCS East, and on the first play of the first drive for the Black Knights, their fullback took a run up the gut for a 70-yard touchdown. And getting into why Zaccheus Randle chose to commit to the Army, while Zaccheus' father, Zach, was an Army officer who routinely visited the East Coast and West Point, Zaccheus was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Zaccheus' lifestyle was totally different from that of his father and his half-brother, Jordan. Growing up in Atlanta, Zaccheus had a lot of pride both on and off the field. Zaccheus didn't necessarily idolize all of the right things. He glorified money, power, and respect above all else, and while Z may not have had the best motivations for going pro one day, it did lead him down the road of being the 4th-ranked quarterback prospect in the nation and the #1 prospect out of Georgia. To everyone's surprise, he didn't commit to the Bulldogs, and instead, his father Zach Meadows pitched him and convinced him to go to the Army. Zaccheus was the highest-ranking recruit to ever commit to the Army straight out of high school, and for good reason. The Army in West Point wasn't a light commitment, and Z made it clear to his father that going pro was his #1 ambition and that he'd need to be able to enter the draft right after graduation. No tour of duty like his dad. His father, Zach, assured him that he could get that done for him. After getting their first win of the season, Zaccheus and the Army had a realistic test in their second game at Florida Atlantic. The Owls had dropped their first game, but at least they were a Division I school, and it was their first away game. Z and the offense got into a 3rd and 2 at the beginning of the game and used some misdirection to spring Tyrell Robinson for a 50-yard run that got the Knights down to the FAU red zone. Zaccheus later capped the drive off with a speed option keeper for a touchdown on 3rd and goal. On the following drive, the Knights elected to go for it on 4th down and goal, and on Zaccheus' 10th carry, he looked like he was running out of gas a little bit and just barely missed getting into the end zone for a second score. On the next 2 drives, Zaccheus and the offense had to settle for field goals, and FAU regained the lead. Probably the biggest nightmare for this offense is not controlling the game. If Zaccheus and the Knights are down late in the game, it can get really ugly unless Zaccheus can make something out of nothing. This all came down to composure, and Randle kept his composure throughout the 3rd quarter, trailing for the first time. He managed the game and eventually made a pitch to Tyrell on the left hash that allowed Robinson to take it in for a touchdown to regain the lead. FAU got another field goal with 2 minutes left, and the Knights and Z would need to put together the perfect setup plays to eventually get a game-winning field goal. You'd think, but for some reason the Army hates kickers. There could be a reason for that, and when it came down to the red zone, Army's coach, Jeff Monken, put the ball in Zaccheus Randle's hands to make plays. On 4th down, instead of kicking a chip shot field goal, they asked Zaccheus to throw, and he delivered a perfect ball to Miles Stewart, the backup running back, for what would be the game-winning touchdown. Army life brought its own unique challenges that Zaccheus had to adjust to sooner than later, waking up at 5 a.m. every day, not talking out of turn, not questioning trainers or coaches. Zaccheus had long survived on pure talent and love for the game, but that wasn't enough to be one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time alone. Z needed discipline, routine, and a carefully crafted structure to take him to the next level. The Army offense fell in line with this level of discipline. The offense was reactive to the defense, but it was also prescriptive. If this happens, do this. But if this other thing happens, do that. Reading and reacting in the triple option was key to its success, and at first, Z and the offense took full advantage of the triple option, and it led them to consecutive wins. Guess what else is critical within the Army offense? Not turning the ball over. So when Z threw an interception to Rice in the 3rd quarter, it set the offensive passing game back, and it put the Army in a larger hole. They found themselves down 6, needing a touchdown with a minute left, and it seemed like Army would take their first loss in 4th and 30 when Zaccheus made another magical play, running outside the pocket and finding his tight end behind the safeties for the first down. Zaccheus and the offense got down to the 10-yard line, and Z thought he had Tyrell for the first down, but it was knocked away with 20 seconds left, forcing the 4th down. Zaccheus ended up picking up the first down himself on the read option keeper. The Knights were down to 1 timeout and 13 seconds left. Their first run, stuffed. Second run, stuffed. Monken again relied on Zaccheus for a bailout, and he delivered another perfect ball on the sideline that only his tight end could get for the walk-off touchdown. Army hating kickers again went for 2, and Zaccheus delivered again. Really a special drive that Zaccheus put together, converting 2 4th downs, one being 4th and 30 from his own 2-yard line, a 3rd and goal touchdown pass, and converting the 2 points for the win. Zaccheus and the Black Knights were off to a hot 3-0 start, and the Army has experienced successful seasons in the past, so it wasn't unbelievable to see a 3-0 start, but it was definitely rare for the program. Zach Meadows told Zaccheus that he envied his role as quarterback of the Army offense. I wish I had the opportunity to quarterback this offense when I was with the Army. Being able to make decisions in this offense was so important. While the strength of opponent wasn't elite, any success on the field was to be celebrated for the Army, considering it was an overall afterthought to what was being learned each day at West Point. There were early cracks in the armor on this offense, though. The only player that was truly on Zaccheus' level was Tyrell Robinson, the senior running back. He was the #1 running back, receiver, and even tight end at times for this offense. He was 10 times the player of the next person up, and it was definitely a concern to Z that Tyrell would be graduating after this year. The offense relied so heavily on Tyrell and Zaccheus to make plays, and if it was 3rd and long, if the offense had any hope of converting, it meant Zaccheus would need to pull a rabbit out of his hat, either scrambling around and finding Tyrell open in man, or whoever the receiver was in open space within the zone. Or the third option, like in this case against Temple, was Zaccheus needing to run and create outside of structure. Zaccheus having to create outside of the offense was kind of the antithesis of what the Army was all about. No man left behind, stay with your team, trust each other, etc. These were values that the Army was trying to ingrain in Zaccheus, but he stood out without even trying. With 2 minutes left against Temple, Zaccheus barely got the ball before being hit by a Temple pass rusher, but somehow Zaccheus magically pitched the ball off to Tyrell, who took it all the way for a touchdown. Temple scored in under a minute, and the Knights were back playing from behind again in this game, and after getting sacked on 1st down, Randle found Robinson, who was at tight end for the snap, streaking across the field to put them within field goal range. Obviously, the Army hates field goals, so they continued trying for a touchdown, and Tyrell capped the drive off with a score for another miraculous last-second comeback win for the Army. In Week 5, the Army was playing against Tulsa, and the strength of schedule was becoming more challenging as the offense and defense faced some difficulties midway through the season. After starting out the season hot, it would be a letdown to backslide into a streak of losses. Zaccheus was starting to adapt to the discipline of the Army and the style of the offense, and he felt like that he had a good grasp of situational pitching and when to keep versus give the ball to Tyrell, but even if every decision was made correctly, the offensive line still needed to do their job. One issue with the offense was obviously that the Army didn't pass the ball a lot or have a lot of good skill position players. This limited the extent of how Zaccheus could affect the game. While he was an elite running quarterback, guess what? He was also pretty damn good at throwing the ball, but this was limited to 3rd and long in general, and Zaccheus argued for more unique passing plays in the offense, but it was seen just as that, Zaccheus stepping outside of his role and questioning authority. The offense chugged along, Zaccheus making another pitch to Tyrell for a touchdown to take a big 14-point lead, and unfortunately, on 2nd down on the following drive, Randle was sacked for a safety after Tulsa scored a touchdown, and it completely 180'd the momentum. Tulsa got 2, and then scored before half, and scored to start the 3rd quarter. Fast forward, and the Knights and Zaccheus were down 14. Randle tried another quick pitch to Robinson, which the D lineman snatched out of midair, and the Army would take their first L in disgusting fashion. Randle got one nice passing touchdown in before the game ended, and that was that. UAB with a 4-1 record was going to be the biggest test of the season up to this point, and through the 1st quarter it was a slog on offense. It was like there was no rhythm to the offense, and Tyrell and Zaccheus needed to get first downs on pure grit alone. After the 1st quarter, Army was in a familiar spot being down, but finally to begin the 2nd quarter, Z scrambled outside the pocket for their first score to tie the game. UAB scored again, and Zaccheus and the offense needed to move the ball down the field quickly, and once they got to the 50, they needed a Hail Mary in the end zone, and while Randle created enough time for his receivers to get down the field, they had very little awareness of actually trying to win the ball, and it ended up getting picked. Randle took matters into his own hands with a great read option keeper for nearly 50 yards and a hurdle that put the Knights into the red zone, and momentum was killed just immediately, just like last game, again by a sack and a penalty that put the Army back at the 35 on 3rd and goal, and UAB would go on to win by 2 scores. East Carolina is a school that's always had a pretty solid offense, and so Randle and the Army knew they'd have to control the tempo of this game to get the win, and they started out hot with a drive for a touchdown, primarily relying on the classic triple option. And after a successful 2-point conversion, the offense really struggled to get momentum, and surprisingly, East Carolina's D-line was dominating the Army's tackles in this game for the outside runs and on the pass plays, and Zaccheus was sacked on back-to-back plays, and the game started to get a little bit out of hand. Army had a timely set of productive plays with Randle hitting his tight end deep, and then their fullback took a run down to the 9-yard line before the Army went for it on a 4th down with a quarterback run, and it was stuffed and Zaccheus fumbled. The game was basically over, but Z had another insane play on 2nd and goal in a must-convert situation, buying time with his legs, looking like Russell Wilson, and throwing a dangerous ball back across his body for the touchdown before the end of the game. Zaccheus kept showing flashes of why he was a 5-star amidst an offense that was insanely boring to watch, and he finished with a touchdown and 0 picks with nearly 200 yards, but was badly beat up after the game. In week 8, it was time for the military academy grudge match between the Air Force and the Army, and the Air Force was up early 13-0 in this game, and the Army wasn't a heavily covered football program, but some reporters began to notice the slide in the win-loss columns and began to question what was going on, and the Black Knights weren't appointment viewing, so a lot of their games went unwatched in the national media, even with their new 5-star freshman quarterback, and reporters who did actively follow the program began to question why the Army was losing all of these games lately. The fact of the matter was that the style of offense they ran, there simply wasn't a lot of margin for error, and looking back at the first 4 games of the season, some of those games were nail-biters that the Army should have lost. The questions turned from the team and coaching to Zaccheus, the new quarterback on the team. It seemed like Zaccheus wasn't progressing much as a quarterback, and that was accurate. Zaccheus had made very little progress at becoming a better thrower, or even increasing his physical attributes. He stayed relatively stagnant in what was a relatively stagnant offense, and Zaccheus' lack of progress was concerning to both his mother and his father. His mom, Jeannie, questioned if Zaccheus was having fun doing what he was doing, and Zaccheus really didn't know at this point. This was supposed to be an insane experiment to see the damage that Zaccheus could do on the ground as a run-first quarterback in an offense that accentuated his skill set. But Zach could tell that Zaccheus was not having an easy time during his freshman year, but more than anything, he wanted Zaccheus to stay the course. And while Jordan had transferred to South Carolina for this season, Zach impressed upon Zaccheus the importance of building lifelong relationships with these teammates that he has. Going back to teammates, Zaccheus was worried about what life at the Army would look like after Tyrell left. Both of these guys carried the offense, and Zaccheus didn't see anyone in line to step up to take over Tyrell's role. Zaccheus was doing all of his practices, he was hitting the gym and grinding tape even, but without any real improvement. Even though Zaccheus wasn't improving much, it didn't mean that he wasn't good. Unlike his brother, Zaccheus wasn't living off the family last name, and Z had delivered a win for the Army over the Air Force that would shut up some of the doubters and reporters for the time being. Zaccheus and the Army needed just one more win to secure a bowl game, and they felt confident in getting that done against North Texas. And after a hot start, Zaccheus threw a really bad pick in double coverage across the middle of the field, staring down his receiver the entire time. And Zaccheus had some insanely unshakable confidence, though, coming back with a nice deep ball across the middle, one of the few plays that seemed to work for this offense, just running all the receivers down the field 4 verticals, and Randle shoved his way into the end zone for an early lead, and after converting the 2, they led 11-6. The Army trusted Randle to deliver on 3rd and 4, and he shook off that early pick with a touchdown on the slant to give Army a 2-score lead, which they would end up needing as North Texas would score one more time, and the Knights finally clinched a bowl game. Zaccheus and the Army had their biggest test of the season against number 10 ranked Notre Dame, and Zaccheus entered into the game already banged up from the previous week against North Texas. Zaccheus was spending more time with the team physical therapist than on the practice field lately. Being a run-first quarterback in Army system was thrilling, but it was also punishing. Zaccheus found himself taking more hits than he ever had in high school. Every game seemed to push his body closer to the limit, and as the weeks went on, the physical toll became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the tackles, it was the way that they felt, harder, sharper, and more frequent. He'd break free on a scramble, cut past one defender only to get sandwiched by 2 more, and the adrenaline rush of a big play started to wear off quicker and quicker, replaced by the dull ache that seemed to settle deeper into his muscles after every game. In the locker room, the traders started to notice. "You good, Randle?" one of them asked after Zaccheus limped off the field. After this particularly brutal loss to Notre Dame, which ended 50-13, he waved them off with a grin, trying to convince himself that he was fine, but he wasn't. By the time Army was heading into its final stretch of games, Zaccheus was playing hurt more often than not. His ribs were bruised, his shoulders ached, and his legs, once his greatest asset, felt like lead by the 4th quarter, and he was pushing through it, but it was getting harder and harder to keep up. Zaccheus' throwing speed and ability to scramble would diminish as he often took on the workload of 30 carries a game at quarterback, and Zaccheus had a small frame, unlike his father Zach, who was 6'4" and 240 pounds, which limited how much punishment that he could take from these linebackers. As the season came down to the last 2 games, Zaccheus had to face the reality of his situation. His body was telling him something that he didn't want to hear, but deep down, he knew that his brother Jordan was right. He told Zaccheus, "You can't keep playing like this without putting everything that you've worked for at risk." Zaccheus knew it, but he really felt like a leader on this team along with Tyrell. He was the whole offense and didn't want to give up on running as much as he did. After one particularly rough game against Notre Dame and then against UTSA, where he took more hits than he could count, Zaccheus finally spoke to his team's trainers. He didn't want to, but he knew that he needed to get checked out, and the verdict was clear. He had been playing through multiple minor injuries that had compounded over the season, and if he kept pushing, it would only get worse, and it was a hard pill to swallow. Zaccheus had envisioned his freshman year at Army going differently. He imagined leading the team to victories and becoming a standout in their run-heavy offense, and proving to himself and his family that he could handle the dual pressures of football and military life, but the reality was harsher than he had anticipated. His body was breaking down, and he had to face the truth that he could not keep going like this. And one night after practice, Zaccheus called Jordan, and he didn't even need to explain. Jordan already knew. You've given it everything, Z. No one can say that you haven't, but you've got to think long term. It's not worth it if you can't walk away from this game healthy. The words hit Zaccheus really hard. He had always been the type to push through and to fight until the very end, just like his brother and his father had taught him. And that conversation with Jordan was the turning point. Zaccheus realized that he had nothing left to prove. His freshman year hadn't gone exactly as planned, but he had shown resilience and toughness in ways that went far beyond the field. He had led his team, taken the hits, and kept going even when his body screamed to rest. The trainers actually pushed for him not to play against Navy, but he didn't want to go out that way. He needed to finish the season out at least. He was having a great game, finding his receiver in the back right corner of the end zone for a score that would lead to a tied game in the fourth, but in the fourth, Zaccheus would be forced into another safety this season on a pass play from the 2-yard line, and down by 7 at the 50, Z got strip sacked and the game was over. A 6-6 record, far from what they expected after a 4-0 start. Despite only 10 passing TDs to 17 picks, Zaccheus rushed for over 1,000 yards and made freshman All-American. Zaccheus had plenty of time to get rested up and healthy against Syracuse for their Military Bowl, and it was easy to tell that Z was playing at 100%. After the big run by Miles Stewart to get to the red zone, Zaccheus kept the ball for himself on the triple option and went untouched into the end zone for an early score. Zaccheus followed that up on the next drive with an identical play, and eventually number 26, Clerk, the running back, scored another touchdown. The Army scored on a fumble return touchdown, and then eventually in the fourth quarter it was a victory lap as they killed the clock against Syracuse and went out with a winning record after all the trials of the season. Randle ended up getting player that came, and Zaccheus' happiness after the game was short-lived because he knew what he had to do next to preserve himself and his potential career in the NFL. Stay tuned for what's to come in Zaccheus Randle's sophomore season.